Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Professor Lynn Garafola is Professor Emerita of Dance at Barnard College, Columbia University. She's the author of Diaghilev's Ballets Russes and Legacies of 20th-Century Dance, editor of José Limón, an unfinished memoir, and other books, and curator of several exhibitions, including Dance for a City, 50 Years of the New York City Ballet, and Arthur Mitchell Harlem's Ballet Trailblazer. Now, you have all these merits, but the big thing is that you published a unique biography. There has been a memoir, self-biography, but you published La Nijinska, Choreographer of the Modern, which is a very impressive book published by Oxford University Press. And it is the memoir of Nijinska, a famous dancer who is very famous on her own, but she is also the sister of the famous Bronislava Nijinska, and her very interesting and very movable life. Let's say she changed so many places, but basically, even if she studied at the Imperial Ballet School in St. Petersburg with the famous everything choreographer and so on, so her petit pas, she then worked twice for Diaghilev in the Ballets Russes, first around 1911, 1912 with her brother Václav, and then when the brother was ill and not well, she worked again in the Ballets Russes in 1921 for several years, and then she left, and for the rest of her life, which we will see, became an independent choreographer, professor, dancer. You focus your attention on Nijinska. Can you tell me why and how it was to write this huge book of more or less 500 pages?
And that's the edited version. Right. I cut 30% of it before publication. I became fascinated with her after I read her own memoir, which she called Early Memoirs, which was published in 1981. After many years, she had been working on it. Then she died. Then her daughter put it aside. Then she came back to it. And it seemed to me to open this new vista on a way of looking at the Ballets Russes, of looking at the sensibility and subjectivity of a young dancer who is growing up in the Ballets Russes, is discovering new things every minute. And eventually you see how she participates in the making of Nijinska's first ballets, Afternoon of a Faun, and then The Rite of Spring. And then eventually how she seems poised to carry on his work. And so that was what fascinated me. At that point, I had not seen any of her choreography live, but beginning in, probably sparked in some measure by the publication of Early Memoirs, suddenly a number of companies began doing some of her choreographies, which previously only two of them were available to see in London. Les Noces and Les Biches were danced by the Royal Ballet. And I became fascinated with the choreography. I used to fly out to California when Oakland Ballet was doing things. I'd fly from New York on Friday afternoons, see 5 performances, and then fly back to New York on Sunday night on what's called the red eye. And I became increasingly interested in how she inflected certain kinds of very classical choreographies with her own sensibility. But at that point, I didn't really know that much about her. I knew about her in relation to the Ballets Russes, but I knew next to nothing about what had happened to her during World War I, during the Revolution. I knew very, very little of what had happened afterwards when she pursued her own career on so many different continents, in different countries.
Of course, you digged in what was partly unknown to you of her existence and her life, and you recapped relationship with friends, letters, diaries. Mm-hmm. But what we should say is that she has different phases. First of all, she comes from a family, of Polish dancers,
Yes.
And Václav was born in Kiev.
Yes, Václav was born in Kiev. She is born in Minsk.
Bielorussia, which are incredible countries, especially today. And then what is interesting is that the whole life, am I wrong or right? I don't know. She had nostalgia for Russia.
Yes.
She studied in St. Petersburg, right? At the Imperial Ballet School first with her brother Václav.
Yes. But her first lessons were actually at home, were with her family. When her father would arrange things for them to do for a Christmas performance at whatever opera house in the borderlands of Russia where he was working. Then in St. Petersburg, even in St. Petersburg, when she was growing up, reading and writing in Russian, having a Russian education, a Russian dance education, but also a Russian secular education, she and her brother would go to catechism class with the Polish priest because they were Polish, they were Catholic. So there was always this edge of difference with whom she was, even when she worked in Kiev during the First World War and during the Revolution. There had been Nijinsky relatives in Kiev. Kiev had a very big Polish population. At some point, I was trying to speculate, who is she? What is her identity? And then when she's in Poland in the late 1930s, and she goes to this former imperial hunting lodge, and she says, and writes in her diary, after all these years, I am on Russian soil, how good it feels. Then you realize that the loss of Russia, as she always called where she had lived before. She never said, I lived in Ukraine or I was born in Belarus. She always said, I was born in Russia.
Two empires, because first she was part of the imperial situation, yes, revolution, and then of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine was part of it. Now, what we have to say is she learns a lot for Petit Pas, but then for a few years, until 1911, she works for the Mariinsky, no?
Yes, she certainly, to the extent that she was dancing these ballets by Petit Pas, by Lev Ivanov, these ballets became part of her muscle memory, part of her imaginary. Although at the time she disliked them intensely. She felt as a member of the corps de ballet or possibly as a demi-soloist, she was just expected to be like everyone else. She was to jump the same height as everyone else, even if she had a higher jump. She was, in a sense, to be faceless, to be part of this massive organization. She also felt that there was a lack of creativity, the lack of musicality, that the dancers were not involved in any expressive way in what was happening. So while, yes, this body of work was, in a sense, her first mentor.
But then she had the same experience that she will have it all one way or the other. She had to be tough and work hard because even in the Diaghilev world, that at the beginning, I think the big man with Diaghilev is Fokine, And then we see many others. We see Coquelin, Fokine, Bassine, Balanchine, and then artists like Cocteau, Picasso, composers like Debussy, Stravinsky, Milhaud, and so on. But she works next to all these giants in a way,
Yes.
And she's very good, but she's a woman.
She's very good, but she's a woman, although she did command a certain amount of respect. I think in terms of what you might call a genuine collaborative relationship, I think she had one with Poulenc. She very much loved working. She loved Poulenc's music for Les Biches. And later she did a little ballet of his called Obad. It was done at a salon performance, the Noailles family. And Poulenc always said he loved that performance more than any other performance of the melancholy that he had written into it. It was an all-female cast. I also think she had a very good relationship with Stravinsky in 1923. He certainly respected what she achieved. Of course, he had a very different vision of what the ballet should be. He wanted something originally much more folkloric. He wanted Vera Sudekina, who was his lover at the time, to be the bride. And Nijinska had a very different vision of that.
On your point of view, she was a more important dancer or choreographer?
I would say at this point, she became more important as a choreographer because, of course, at some point she had to retire from active dancing on the stage. And moreover, choreography was eventually what really interested her, what really was compelling to her, although she was still drawn to performance. Her body still wanted to perform.
Her love life, I mean, she was twice married. She had children. Sadly, she lost in the 30s one of her children in a car accident when he was 16. But very important real or imaginary love is with Jaliapine, who was a famous basso that she met in Monte Carlo and the 2011, 12, with lots of obstacles from the Diaghilev world, right? I mean, they sort of...
Lots of obstacles. Diaghilev, her brother, everyone except herself and her best friend or something. Yes, and this became this fantasy that sustained her for years and years afterwards. To read some of her journals in the 1920s where she says, I've done all of this for you. By all of this, she means, say, all the choreography that she did for the Ida Rubinstein Company. I've done it all for you. And you didn't come to see my performance. And it kind of went on. And then when she actually does work with him on a regular basis in the 1930s, when her company and some of his opera company would perform together, he pretty much ignored her. And she was just desperate for his attention. She was like a lapdog that just wanted to be petted. And of course, here she was, this very important choreographer.
What is her relationship with her brother? Because also her brother, the famous Nijinski, right? Sometimes he was very friendly, sometimes he was less friendly. I mean, how does she depict her brother?
Well, the older she got, the more saintly he became. And by the end, you almost, in some of the later versions of the unpublished manuscript, which was called My Brother Vatsa, Nijinsky can do almost no wrong. And yet, again and again, the individual instances shows he's sometimes very cruel to her. He's goading of her, and then in some ways very neglectful of her. And in some measure tries to block her career. He didn't want her to join the Diaghilev company. When she gets married, he's furious. When she gets pregnant, he's furious. He throws her out of the cast of The Rite of Spring. He throws her out of all his ballets, although all of them in some measure were worked out with her assistance. So it's a very complicated relationship. Also, it was always colored by the fact how she looked at him later on, by what she saw in Vienna in 1921 after she left Ukraine and she sees him in the sanatorium.
In 1914, she stops working for the Ballets Russes. She to Russia, right, and in Kiev, and then she has a taste not only of going back home, but also of the revolution. And often later, she was accused of being Bolshevik.
No, you're absolutely right. She never denounced the revolution. There may have been things she didn't like, and I know from her diary there were things she didn't like, but she didn't say them publicly. For her, it was a moment of possibility. She had a studio, they had firewood, they had food rations. She was able to choreograph. She was able to perform publicly with her group, doing choreography. She was on committees. I know she wrote some things, although we haven't found them, but they may turn up one day. So this was a wonderful period for her. It was, in many respects, the beginning of the future.
But then she leaves. She goes back to Vienna with her mother to see Václav.
Well, they don't just go back to visit. I mean, they pack up and they have to leave illegally.
And if I'm not wrong, she meets Romola, right?
Yes.
Who she called Roma, his wife.
Yes.
And Romola has been the cause of the litigation between Diaghilev and Nijinsky, no?
Yes.
What happened? And how he became ill, insane? I mean, how did all this happen?
Well, I personally believe that there was a chemical imbalance in his family. I think there was an inherited predisposition to manic depression, to some kind of mental illness. Her mother had been extremely depressed. There was an older brother who was in an asylum for many years and then died during the revolution. Nijinsky had time in 1914 when he was clearly mentally unstable. And then, of course, Nijinska doesn't see him in the US for the tours. Romola made life difficult because she sued Diaghilev for a vast amount of money, which he claimed in back pay to Nijinsky, although he certainly had been supported very generously by Diaghilev during their years together.
Diaghilev is impresario and his lover. Now they were together.
Yes, they lived together.
And how come he became Romola's husband, and what happened with Diaghilev?
Well, Diaghilev was first of all furious when he heard that Romola and Nijinsky had gotten married in Buenos Aires on a tour that Diaghilev decided he did not want to go on. And he basically fired Nijinsky. At that point, Romola was very anxious for him to find other places to work, but it was quite difficult. They did sign a contract with the Paris Opera, but World War I came and the opera just closed to public performances for a couple of years. And of course, she insisted on him going back to Hungary, and then World War I came and he was stuck in Hungary as an enemy alien, married to Romola, who was Hungarian. He seems to have lost the bearings. He seemed to have lost the structure that had enabled him to live and to function in his previous life. There were no classes in the morning unless he gave himself a class. There were no rehearsals. None of the things that had been part of his life before that were present. He rejoined the Ballets Russes in the US with Romola, and many dancers observed that he seemed to be different. He seemed to be strange. He was doing strange things. He was sometimes paranoid. The paranoia was abetted by his wife. It was just not a good situation. And then eventually they left the Ballets Russes and went to Switzerland. And it's in Switzerland, this is now around 1918, the war is coming to an end, that he really seemed to have just lost it. And she began taking him to psychiatrists and others, and he was then confined to a series of sanatoria and eventually a mental hospital.
His sister, Nijinska, she's penniless and has a family, and there she begs Diaghilev to help her. And how strange that Diaghilev, who was so furious with Nijinsky, who was a misogynist in a way, he still gives her a chance, no?
Well, he sent one of his friends, Walter Nouvel, to Vienna to talk to Nijinska, to see what was happening. And she spoke to him very extensively, talked about all the things she had done in Kiev, the choreography she had done, and she felt that she was following from the line that Nijinsky had opened in The Rite of Spring. This is then reported by Nouvel back to Diaghilev, and Diaghilev's quite interested. So he basically hires her and then says, well, your first assignment is going to be to do some additions and some re-choreographing of Petipa's Sleeping Beauty. Nijinska was shocked. That was the last thing in the world that she wanted to do at that moment, having been what she had just been through in Kiev and started doing all kinds of wonderful things.
This is also because Diaghilev and some other Russians were refugees and they were outcasted from the Soviet regime, right? So they didn't really know the new Russia. They knew the old Russia.
Well, not only did they know the old Russia, they had no interest in the new Russia. And the new Russia, ironically, in its very early stages, was very supportive of modernism, of modern art, visual art, modern forms of theater. Think of Meyerhold and Mayakovsky, Eisenstein, all of these really prominent artists who were supported, as I say, in the early years by the left-wing regime. So that when Nijinska turns up, many of the dancers sort of looked at her, like she's strange. They just wanted to collect their paycheck. They didn't care what they danced. And for her, it was very important what you danced.
She produces two very important ballets, Les Biches and then Les Noces. Les Noces is practically her masterpiece, right? I mean,
yes.
She's famous for, no?
No question. And of course, it's one of Stravinsky's great scores as well. It was a score that had gone through many transformations from when Stravinsky first conceived it as something that was an extension of the Rite of Spring, and then gradually it became more and more, you might say, stringent, reduced to 4 pianos, percussion, voice. And somehow when Nijinska heard that, it just touched a chord in her, what can I say, her soul. And she said, this is how I see this ballet. And she had a very clear idea right from the start that it should be stark, that there should be these masses, these human masses that would construct a kind of architecture of this experience, this marriage experience, and that it was profoundly sad in many ways. This was not a happy wedding.
The relationship
This
between
was a
Stravinsky and Nijinska.
At this point, I think it was quite good. He had liked what she had done the previous year. He knew her as a dancer in the company before World War I. He may not have liked necessarily the vision that she brought to it. He had originally imagined something that was more folkloric, but ultimately he did not complain about it at all. And I think he felt that she was extraordinary in a very sophisticated way that she linked music and movement.
In 1925, because of the hostility of Diaghilev and his group, which included Cochneau, Massine, and Cocteau, she left in 25.
Yes.
And since then, she became independent. With a parenthesis that in 1928, if I'm not wrong, she's engaged by a famous ballerina, very wealthy and powerful, which is Ida Rubinstein.
Yes, she actually did have a number of commissions. I mean, Ida Rubinstein was one of them, but she also spent 2 very long seasons. Those would be 9-month seasons at the Teatro Colón in the late 1920s. She returned in the 1930s to the Colón. So that was another important repository of her works. I think at the Colón, she loved the young dancers who were very eager to follow her. I think she enjoyed the fact that there was a symphony orchestra and there was a growing school of ballet at the Teatro Colón. She had other encounters, you might say, with state-supported theaters. One of them was in Vienna, and that did not work out at all. She couldn't wait to get back to Paris, to Chaliapin, to the various emigre companies. That she felt was her world, even though she longed to have a theater where she had some stability, but somehow Vienna was not the place. And then she had a relationship that was very productive with the Polish ballet in 1937 and 1938. It ultimately ended unhappily, but she did 2 very remarkable works for that company.
If I'm not wrong, she also did, in 1934, a choreography of dances for the first Max Reinhardt's movie, no?
Yes.
Summer Night's Dream.
Yes, she did that. And I think California was a revelation to her.
She went forever, let's say, in 1939, no?
Well, she went forever in 1939. I don't think she wanted to be in California in 1939. However, it was her daughter. She first stayed in New York City, and then eventually she went out to California. There are some letters that indicate that she was very unhappy in California initially. She wanted to be on the East Coast. She wanted to be around friends of hers because she had many friends in the New York area. She did not want to be there in California where it was beautiful every single day. It never rained.
Yeah, but I mean, she lived in America, where she went back and forth. She lived in America for 30 years.
Yes, yes.
What you write in your book is that she didn't really speak English well.
That's true. That is absolutely true. And so she had a difficult time speaking with her grandchildren. She had 2 grandchildren, neither of whom spoke Russian. I mean, she did speak a little bit of English. There are some testimonials of dancers in her classes whom she particularly liked. One reminded her of her brother. Another reminded her of someone else. And she would say, shh, and then she'd speak to them in English, because in class she would speak some French, she'd have her husband translating, sometimes she'd speak Russian, but she did speak some English. I think she was afraid perhaps that she didn't express herself as well as she might have wanted to.
She spoke well French, right?
It depended. If she was spending time in France, yes, she spoke French.
And then you also say that she was
well.
ruthless in this man's world, and that she was also sometimes very rude.
Yes. There are many testimonials about how rude she could be to people, and then also many testimonials about how nice she could be to people. There are testimonials about how she would just make someone repeat something 20 times until they were dropping with sweat and in exhaustion until they got it right. After that, she never bothered with them. It's like they had passed some kind of test. They had submitted to her. Now, there was a very funny story when she was working for ballet theater in the early 1940s. This was in New York City, and one of the dancers in something or other that she was choreographing was Jerome Robbins. And Jerome Robbins comes in, he doesn't take his place at the bar, he's just very disrespectful to her. She's furious with him. The irony is this is exactly what Jerome Robbins was behaving in a way that he himself hated, and he ended up behaving in the way that she could be at her most ruthless. Although Nijinska never was, I would say, psychologically abusive, the way some choreographers like Anthony Tudor and Jerome Robbins could be.
She has all these things, but around the 60s, the coming of the 60s, she disappears from stage. I mean, she's no more performed or whatever. And if I am not wrong, there is a revival in 1966. You spoke about it before in London, yes, of Les Noces et les Biches, no? Yes. By Frederick
Ashton.
Yes. And this is her last exploit, no, in a way.
Yes, this was her last hurrah, if you will. It was immensely important because, as you say, she was kind of forgotten. She had left the Grand Ballet, the Marquis de Cuevas company, in 1960. It was not in the best circumstances. And she went back to the US, and basically she hid out for 2 years. She didn't talk to anyone for 2 years, except her family. And then she gets a note a little bit later from Frederick Ashton saying, would it be possible for you to come and stage Les Biches on the Royal Ballet? And she said, of course, I remember it perfectly. And she goes off and stages it and was a great success. And then he says, 2 years later in 1966, would you come back and do Les Noces? And she said, yes. And that was really important. The way this happened, these ballets were notated, they were filmed, they were kept in repertory. In other words, they just weren't performed during a season and then dropped. They cycled back in. New people stepped into different roles so that they had a long afterlife when Nijinska was gone. And because the Royal Ballet was so central in Europe, the other companies began writing to her and asking her to stage Biche and Les Noces, less Les Noces because that was much more complicated, but certainly Les Biches, even to choreograph something. But unfortunately, it came a little too late. And while Nijinska was able to do something, she had some serious illness began to plague her in the late 60s. So
because she was a compulsive smoker, no?
Yes, she was a heavy smoker, yes. She began smoking not in Russia, but with Diaghilev in like 1922, 23. I think he drove her to it. He worked her so hard.
You devoted so much time on this woman. Why? Because you thought there was a basic injustice vis-a-vis her? I mean, is she really very important on the level of the others in the Russian ballet? And lately, is she comparable to the Martha Grahams or other famous women?
I definitely think she's comparable to Martha Graham in that she was someone who had a definite point of view. The difference being Martha Graham created her own movement language. Nijinska did not create a movement language. She used the language of ballet, but she inflected it in a different way so that it came out looking more like a personal instrument than your average ballet choreographer. I think her works stand comparison with Massine's works. They're musically far more complicated and far more sophisticated. I think her use of classical language is far more sophisticated than Massine's. The only choreographer who truly exceeds her is Balanchine, who lived a very long, productive life. I also think it shows not only that who is better and who is worse, but that there were many ways in which modernism and neoclassicism developed in ballet. And Balanchine's is not the only way it could have gone. Nijinska's work shows that there were other possibilities. There were different alternatives. It wasn't just either or. I think she's enormously important as an artistic figure. I was also interested in why there were so many contradictory things that I was reading about her. People who would say, oh, she was so kind to me, she showed me X and Y, and then others who would say she was just so mean. And others who felt that she had really given them a gift in terms of their own career, in terms of where they were going. I was stunned by the number of women who came through her companies in the 1930s or late 20s, who went on to found their own companies in Australia or in other places, so that she inspired a lot of women. But because of the dispersion of this Russian emigration after the Second World War, it's very hard to find evidence of that. Because, of course, in the 1920s and 30s, she belonged to this very big, very broad community of Russian emigres, which was centered in Paris.
The point of your book may be that this woman has dedicated since ever her entire life to ballet, one way or the other, choreographer, dancer, professor, has touched the most important figures of her century of her life in the field, has worked with amazing composers and dancers and choreographers. Probably this is what has fascinated you, that even if she trusted only her family, is what you say in the book, nevertheless, she gave probably more importance to her dance, to her world of dance, than to the family. She was
Absolutely.
totally devoted to that, no?
She was totally devoted to her work. She was very lucky that she lived with her mother until her mother died in 1932. So Nijinska's daughter, Irina, told me, it was really my grandmother who raised me. I barely saw my mother. And as I began working on the book, it was perfectly clear that Irina and her brother spent far more time with their grandmother than with their mother. Although, of course, her guilt is very clear. Nijinska's guilt is very clear from her diaries. She was guilty about leaving her children, but of course, she still left them. Later on, when they were older, especially her daughter, who was a dancer, she would put her into different companies that Nijinska, in a sense, for her daughter. She was providing for her husband, who would always have some little job connected with whatever Nijinska was doing. I
She
think
also
it
had
was
a very complicated and odd relationship with Nijinska's wife, Romola, no? I mean,
yes.
they like each other, they dislike each other, then Romola wants to become her agent for America. There's lots of going and coming.
There's
there.
a lot of going and coming. Basically, Nijinska disliked her sister-in-law intensely, and she blamed her for her brother's condition. Although, as I said earlier in the interview, I believe that there was something constitutional about his insanity, because Nijinska's own son, before he's killed in the automobile accident, he left a terrible document, the pain he has in his head, and he thinks he's hearing things. So he too is very clearly beginning to succumb to some kind of schizophrenia. This must have been terrible for Nijinska to read. And of course, one imagines that she blamed herself for abandoning him, for leaving him. But the other thing about Romola is Romola seemed to be someone who could help Nijinska during the 1920s, because Romola spoke several languages. She was sophisticated. She was able to conduct business correspondence. Nijinska didn't have those skills. She didn't really have an agent who could do this. But Romola was very flighty in certain ways. and was never able to do anything. That's the terrible thing. Had she been able to do something, it would have been fine. But she loved the idea that she might eventually be able to sell some of her husband's ballets to the Paris Opera or to some other theater. So she would be able to make money. She was always thinking about how to make money. But she would do very strange things. Like one day she writes to Nijinska, I have to go to America. Now, you as Nijinsky's sister, as Václav's sister, you must take him in, and you must do it within 2 weeks. Now, this is not really possible because Nijinska needed a new apartment. She had 2 children. Nijinsky and his attendant needed their own room. And it just kind of, went on where Romola, in 1940, she wanted Václav, who was still not well, to enter the United States on a visa. Not possible. And when Nijinsky died,
he died when?
In 1950 in England. And it appears that Nijinska only learned about it from a radio broadcast. She didn't even receive a telegram from her sister-in-law saying that her brother had died.
Yeah, but her sister-in-law kept on living with Nijinsky all his life?
Yes, Romola had lived with Nijinsky all her life, well, except when she was in California. I mean, there were times when she went to California for long periods of time, and Nijinsky was living with a nurse somewhere. Once she left him with her sister, Romola's sister.
What kind of life had Nijinsky in all these years? Because he lived 30 years in...
He was in and out of care. He had to have some kind of nurse with him much of the time. In the mid-1930s, he received a series of several electric shock treatments, and the idea being that he would bounce back to life and he would go back on stage. Well, there was no way he was going to go back on stage, even if he bounced back. But she had these delusions.
But did they have enough money to live decently?
She would raise money to do this, and there would be these galas in London to raise money for Nijinsky. But also she was helped by people who felt sorry for Nijinsky. During World War II, there was a question of what should we do with Nijinsky, and he was in a sanatorium in Switzerland, and they agreed that they would take care of him, whatever happened, no money through the war, because he clearly could be a victim of the Germans. But no, she decided to take him back to Budapest, where she still had family, and it was terrible. And again, she seems to make the wrong decision.
But after all, he's a myth, Nijinsky, but he had a very short career.
Yes.
And the difference is that Nijinska instead had a very long career.
Had a very long career, yes. But, it's the romantic hero who is someone who dies young or disappears very quickly, the genius. This is very much the Nijinsky myth. And geniuses are not people who are worrying about feeding their families. And Nijinska, remember, had the 2 children, her mother, and at various points a husband. This is not a heroic life.
But she remained friendly, she remained interested, she remained close to the brother until he died, or not?
No, she was in the United States beginning in the 1940. She would go back. She worked in France from time to time with the Marquis de Cuevas company. This is after the war. But she wasn't in England, so I don't know that she actually saw her brother, although she certainly may have gone to visit him. She did see him in Paris in the 1930s and in the 1920s, but he didn't seem to recognize people. There's one really tragic incident where he's brought with his nurse to a Ballet Russe rehearsal.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of these rehearsals, but there's one in 1923 or 24, and he just doesn't recognize anyone. And Nijinska's crying. Some of the dancers who had known him before World War I were crying. He just seemed to be in some other space. So having a relationship with him that wasn't one of being his nurse or caretaker, which later in life is what Romola was very, very difficult.
In terms of her relationship with Leonid Massey, Did that go on over the years, and did they work together again?
No. In fact, they really never worked together, although the nearest they came to working together was in the de Basile company when, in 1935, thereabouts, when she did a piece which Massine did not approve in that he had not okayed it in advance. De Basile simply commissioned her. And then subsequently, when she staged Les Noces for the de Basile company in the United States, with the idea that when they went to Europe, it would be done in London, he did everything to make it impossible for her to rehearse it, and it was never given, which is pretty dramatic.
You talk about Massine. She had any relation with Balanchine?
Well, actually, there were more relationships with Balanchine. Many of his early dancers, or a number of his early dancers, had actually studied at her studio on the West Coast. And his third wife, Maria Tallchief, was one of her students, and she had choreographed for her and singled her out. And there were a number of others. Allegra Kent was another early person. I think she felt that Balanchine had life easy. Part of it, I think, had to do with the fact that he traveled light. He didn't have a family when he first came to the West. He had a very easygoing manner that enabled him to raise money fairly easily, even though the early 30s were not a great time for him, and he certainly was ill. At some point, when Maria Tallchief's sister, Marjorie Tallchief, was getting married, she was marrying another dancer in the Marquis de Cuevas company. So they're in the south of France, and all of them, it's Vichy. And there's a wedding, and Balanchine and Maria Tallchief come down from Paris. He was at the Paris Opera House. And Nijinska accosts Balanchine and accuses him of stealing her student, i.e. Maria Tallchief, of stealing her steps in Le Baiser de la Fée. And Balanchine protested, and then eventually she said, "And you are not a gentleman." At which point Balanchine became highly incensed and said, "But I am a gentleman, I am a gentleman." And then the two of them ended up talking about Diaghilev and talked for the rest of the wedding. So I think there was more between her and Balanchine, and respect for some of the things, for Balanchine as a choreographer. Although I'm sure she was extremely angry with the way some of her works, which were in the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo, the Denham Company's repertory, were then thrown out as soon as Balanchine became the artistic director. And that included her Bach ballet, one of the early ballets. She had done an abstract piece, which was then immediately replaced by Concerto Barocco, Balanchine's great ballet. So I've always thought of, if Balanchine had not replaced her ballet with Concerto Barocco, a work I love very, very much, who knows, maybe her Bach ballet, Etude, would have survived a little longer.
So thank you very much for this conversation, Lynn.
Well, thank you.
And good luck with the book.
Alain Elkann interviews.